Surprisingly as it may seem, at the outbreak of the Great War, Britain didn't have the ability to put high explosive into shells. We had explosive shell, but these were mainly of Victorian design and manufacture and were filled with black powder, which is technically not a high explosive. The Germans, on the other hand, put TNT in theirs. Britain didn't like TNT, we thought it was dangerous and expensive to manufacture, and so we were experimenting with an explosive called lyddite, which is derived from picric acid. It's a very unpleasant chemical and it wasn't greatly effective. The French tried it too and they called it melanite. One of the principal differences between black powder and the new high explosives is that black powder is very volatile. It only needs a small flash of flame or a spark to set it off. Not so these new explosives. They were much more stable and they needed a lot more in the way of energy to get them going. The way this was normally achieved at the time was by a fuse that worked in a compound way. What I mean by that is it can be likened to the way we used to light a fire. In a grate at home, you would light paper and the paper gets the kindling going. The kindling then sets fire to the coal. These fuses were the same. There was a portion like the black powder fuse that produced a flash, but that went into a gainer and exploder, which usually took the form of a small pipe bomb that stuck down into the main filling, which in turn set that off. The point I'm making about this is that you couldn't just take your old black powder shell and put the new explosive into it because it just wouldn't work. What was needed was something entirely new. In late 1914, Royal Laboratories at Woolwich Arsenal designed and put into production a fuse that works in the way I've just described in the extraordinarily short time span of 10 days from start to finish. It was a viable design. It was designated the number 100, but it came with a couple of enormous drawbacks. Firstly, it was a graze fuse, which meant it didn't have to directly hit its target to go off. Any kind of change of velocity or direction or glancing blow will set it off. And graze fuses, by their very nature, are mechanically complex. And by taking something novel straight from the drawing board and putting it into mass production by people that weren't used to producing ordnance, they set up almost perfect conditions for engineering fail. It's a big ask to be producing 1 week sewing machines or bicycles and the next week to be making complex ordnance. Consequently, these fuses were very mechanically unreliable because not only were they not up to making them properly, they didn't have the quality control systems to pick up the duds when they were produced. So that's the first thing, it's mechanically unreliable, and there are fundamentally only two ways in which this thing can fail. Firstly, and fortunately most commonly, it's a dud. You fire it, it lays on the ground, it's wasteful, it's expensive, it's inefficient. But the other way is by what's called PD, or premature detonation, which means, as the name suggests, the projectile explodes before you want it to. Now that would normally be while it's travelling up the barrel of the gun. PD had always been a thing with old black powder rounds, but mostly with black powder, although it would be a brown trouser moment, you'd get away with it. Not so these new high explosives. They turned the gun barrel into a bomb, and it was a devastating event for the gun and the crew. And it was calculated in 1915 that that was happening 1 in every 18,000 rounds. So that was the first thing, it's mechanically unreliable. The other major problem with this fuse was not so much a fault as a characteristic, because it was known about at the time of design and was even thought to be beneficial. And that's the fact that because it's mechanically complex, even when it functions absolutely perfectly, there's inherent in the design a very slight delay. Now, when I say a slight delay, I'm talking about a tiny fraction of a second, but this is travelling at 1600 feet a second, so it doesn't take long for it to travel a considerable distance. Now that's fine if you're attacking a trench or an earthwork or even a building, some kind of fortification, because the projectile embeds itself in the target before it goes off, and that works in your favour. Where it becomes a problem is if you're trying to do something unforeseen at that time, like cut barbed wire, because this just won't do it. The delay ensures that the projectile passes through the barbed wire, buries itself in the ground, a lot of the energy is absorbed by the explosion blowing a crater, and your wire remains largely intact. And that fault by itself is largely responsible for the practice of trying to cut barbed wire with shrapnel, which was at best a questionable practice. And this doesn't get properly addressed for 2 years until the introduction of the 106 fuse. The number 100 wasn't a bad design, it was very creditable. It was just a victim of the circumstances under which it was pushed prematurely into action. There were a whole series of these that are externally identical, 101, 102, 103, They're not. They're all either modifications or variations of the original design. And actually, once they were sorted, they served out the rest of the war honourably as a useful part of the gunner's arsenal. They were just a victim of circumstance.